my mom voice. Well, whoever put me in the schedule after Seth is absolutely fired. My name is Morehead. I'm the Executive Director of Recovering from Religion. I hope you guys are having a wonderful time here at Apostacon. So I want to talk to you today about who we are at Recovering from Religion, the people who we help, and how people come to need us. Is anyone here, if you want to self-identify as someone who considers themselves recovering from religion? Anybody? Got some hands? Okay. All right, so what is recovering from religion? Let's see if this is going to look right. There we go. Okay. We are a practical support network for people who are negatively impacted by religion or faith. What that means, or what we are not, is an atheist evangelical organization. We are not deconverters. We are not going out to tell people they are wrong about their belief. That's not the point. People come to us, they tell us that they need our help. It's one of the biggest things I get from the theists when I talk to them. They'll say, you're just trying to convert everybody to atheism. It kind of happens naturally sometimes. That's not our fault. We have multiple support avenues for people who are recovering from religion. We have local support groups all over the United States. We have them starting in Canada, the UK, and Australia. We have online support on Facebook, Reddit, and Twitter. We have a private online support page on Facebook for people who are not out enough on their own Facebook page to be able to interact with our national page. So we have a private page for them where they can get their own support, and we have facilitators who are trained to help them. We have the Secular Therapist Project. Anybody here familiar with that? All right. The Secular Therapist Project is Dr. Darrell Ray's project, and it puts secular therapists in contact with clients who are seeking someone they can count on to provide evidence-based therapy as they deal with whatever struggles in their life they're experiencing. We have the Hotline Project. We are currently vetting volunteers and starting training, doing interviews, all of that. The Hotline Project will be an 800 phone number for people all over the country to be able to call when they have questions. Again, not an atheist deconversion line, totally different thing. They're going to call and say, well, I'm a little afraid that there might not be God, but I'm worried about going to hell. What do I do? It's a big question. We're not going to tell them what to do. We're going to give them resources to go find that answer themselves. We also have the Living After Faith podcast. This is a podcast by Rich and Deanna Joy Lyons. They're here today to do a talk later, but their podcast focuses on helping people in their process as they walk away from faith. One of the things that we put together when I first got involved in recovering from religion is the spectrum of disbelief. You guys are probably familiar with Dawkins' different stages of atheism, different is 1 to 8. This is similar but not quite. We like to point out to people that everyone is on the spectrum of disbelief. A lot of times you'll talk to theists who will say, I am completely monotheistic, I have no doubts, I completely believe everything I'm told about my religion, and that's the be-all end-all. What I like to point out to them, and many of you are familiar with this concept, that just simply by being a monotheist, and we'll ignore the 3 in 1 thing, but simply by saying you're a monotheist, you are by default already on that spectrum of disbelief. We just want them to keep going. So why is RR necessary? Why not, once you've decided you don't believe, once you've decided religion is no longer for you, you don't want to have to write a check every month to buy your way out of hell, why don't you just get over it? Why don't you just grow up? What is so hard about leaving religion? One of the biggest questions I get, or comments I get, stop being a martyr, they just need to get over it. That's a fun one. And this is from the secular community. It's not that simple. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is why that is. There are people who can walk away from all of this unscathed. And for those of you, fantastic. That's great. but for many, many more. This is a long, arduous process, and I'm going to explain why that is. So, my aiming is not working. There we go. Okay. Sorry guys, we jumped ahead a bit. So what about recovering from religion is so difficult? Religion creates dysfunctional thinking. The lessons learned through religion infiltrate current and future relationships. This is something people don't realize. They want to say, I'm done with it, I don't believe in God, it's over, I don't go to church anymore. But then what? Who needs recovering from religion? Obviously the person who identifies as recovering from religion, that's a default. Even the lifelong non-believer, how many people here have never really believed in anything? Quite a few. Here's why you need recovering from religion, okay? Because we want you to better understand what that process is like for those of you, for your peers in the secular movement. That empathy, that ability to understand that struggle, that's how we're going to reach more people. That's how we're going to grow this movement. That's how we're going to grow our secular communities locally, regionally, nationally. And that's why we need you. The religious doubter, they still believe. They're not really sure what to do with it. But we want to encourage and empower them to recognize and use healthy boundaries. Healthy boundaries is one of the first steps to walking away from religion. And we'll get to that in a second. So who am I to talk about all of this? She mentioned I was an evangelical Southern Baptist. I don't think this has a pointer on it, but my grandparents were church planting missionaries. Everybody know what a church planting missionary is? Yeah, lots of them. There we go. Okay. So my grandparents, their job was to travel all over Central America and the Caribbean, and they put churches all over the place. Their home church, their home churches were in the upper mountains of Georgia, and everything that goes with that. I have roots in the Calvinist Baptist teachings. It's very similar to Nate Phelps. You guys already heard from him. The Holy Rollers. My job growing up, I believed, I was put on this planet to bring people to Christ, as were all of you, even if you hadn't gotten the memo yet. When you think of the evangelical who comes up to you and says, do you know what's going to happen when you die, Bill? That was me. And then I would walk you through all of that. Save your soul, add a jewel to my crown. There we go. Evangelical Southern Baptists believe that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God. And this is pretty true of most fundamental religions. This is just where I came from. They usually believe their holy book is inerrant. I believed in baptism by immersion. Anyone here who was sprinkled? Lots of sprinkled? You guys didn't make it. I believe that man is responsible for sin, and all of this is all gonna make sense. I know it seems like I'm jumping around a little bit. It's all gonna come together here in a minute. Man is responsible for sin. Forget that, if God made us, then that kind of puts him at fault. But remember, we're suspending all of that. I believe that the only way to salvation was through the cross. And there were lots and lots of rules about Sundays, about how girls behave, especially about sex. I believe, most importantly, based on all of these teachings, God would bring me the husband I was meant to have. And here's why this is important. For some people that works out when they just sit back and say, well, God's going to bring me my perfect husband. Well, God decided I needed to marry an abusive asshole. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but as our marriage progressed, he got more and more violent. It was encouraged by our church, which was a mega church, thousands and thousands of members. When it became too much for me and for my children, I went to my church and I told them what was happening. He had been abusing me for years. The breaking point for me, for whatever reason, was when he went after my kids. I don't know why. That was it. So I went to my church and I said, I need your help. He's hurting us. I made him leave. I need $600 to pay my bills. I went to the benevolence committee. Anybody here? Nod your head if you're familiar with the concept of the benevolence committee. It's usually a panel of 12 men who it's their job to decide how Jesus wants them to spend their money for people who need help. So I got to sit there in front of 12 men and go through intimate details of my marriage while I asked them for $600. They had to pray about it. It wasn't a snap decision. Jesus takes some consulting. They did. They got back to me. Jesus told them no. As I was leaving the church, I pushed the door open. And I wasn't paying attention because I was crying. I was really upset. And I ran into a guy who was kneeling down. He was putting glass etching on the door. Jesus was totally cool with glass etching. I couldn't pay my rent. And I couldn't feed my kids. That was the moment I had a crack. That wasn't the moment I became an atheist. That was the moment it stopped making sense. It was a long process after that, but that was the first part of it. I wanted to ask, if you guys just shout it out, based on my description of how I grew up and all of that, what kind of a town would you guys say I grew up in? Small, large? Small. How many people here would have guessed Houston, Texas? Exactly. And that's part of why I'm so passionate about what I'm doing. There is a huge misconception that this kind of fundamentalism is solely related to these tiny towns and these tiny churches, and it's not. There are mega churches in every single major city preaching this doctrine to their congregants. There are women in suburbia who look just as normal as everyone else who believe every word of this. You can't necessarily tell interacting with them, but it's what they've been taught by their preachers, their ministers, their Bible school leaders for years. And if they're being abused, if their children are being abused, they are told it's their fault. Go back to Proverbs 31, learn how to be a proper wife. It'll all be better if God wants it to be. My life was not mine to control. Trying to control my life equals sin against my Creator. Worst possible thing ever. Now, they say sin is sin is sin, which is convenient when the pastor's talking about it. But when you grow up being told sinning against the thing that made you is the worst thing ever, and then you're told doing anything to take control of your life, that's exactly what that is. It makes walking into that office and telling them you just made your husband leave one of the most difficult things you'll ever do. Everything that happens is God's will. If it happened, it's God's will. Was it horrible? Sure. God needed it to happen. Is it reprehensible? Completely. It's important to God that that happened. Somewhere down the line, years from now, somebody needed that event to happen for it to touch their life so they could go to heaven. So what does religion really teach the world? You are broken and you need to be fixed. You are lost, you need someone to find you. And these, by the way, I'm not making this up for anyone not familiar with church. This is language straight from churches. You are unworthy and need to be saved. You are sheep that need to be led. You are weak. You have a hole in your heart, and who can fill it? Jesus. Hallelujah. Here's what I really like about this picture, and this is why I grabbed it. This is off of a church website, and they want it to be this message of salvation and hope and all these wonderful things. Can you guys see well enough to see what's on his hands? Shackles. I thought that was an appropriate metaphor. So religion starts this process from a very early age. As soon as children are old enough to understand, they are taught that they are broken, they are wrong. Guilt and shame are fantastic motivators. You add in feelings of reward in exchange for approved behavior, and you have a perfect recipe for religion. But religion has a lot of work to do. How do you impose guilt and shame while getting people to continue to work for the eternal parent? There are thousands of religions. How do you convince people to follow yours instead of someone else's? Start young. Think about it. What are the two biggest outreach areas of religion? Anybody know? Where they put the most money, the most volunteers, the biggest efforts. They want to approach the most vulnerable populations, and there's two of them. Children. Children is one. What's the other one? Anybody know? Prisons. They go after people who are inherently vulnerable. They convince them they are broken because of their own doing, that God made them that way. You guys heard what Seth was saying. That preacher that was on his show, I am unlovable. He is unlovable. What the hell did he do? I mean, we get it. He's a religious guy and he doesn't quite have it all figured out. But really, what did he do? All right. So I want to talk for a few minutes about coercive persuasion. And the reason is, I started doing some research. I wanted to find out what is the commonality between these religions that people are coming to recovering from religion with all of these similar problems. I have people contacting us who are Mennonites, Jewish, Christian of every single flavor imaginable. We have Hindus, we have Muslims, everybody. And they all have the same concerns, they all have the same questions, and they all have the same problems. So I started doing some research. There was a gentleman by the name of Robert J. Lifton. And about 50 years ago, he's a psychologist. About 50 years ago, he started studying prisoner of war survivors from the Korean and the Chinese prison camps. Those are pretty nasty places. And his study was to better understand the concept of coercive persuasion. What's the other name for coercive persuasion? Brainwashing. So as I'm reading through all of this, something dawned on me. Now I was taught that there are 5 steps to Christ, A, B, C, D, E. Yes, 4 steps. I'm a little late. Anyways. But in that, there are very specific things that you have to convince someone to do to embrace the concept of how broken that they are, that they need a Savior. It started making sense. So the first step that he learned about was breaking down the self. Now this is 50 years ago. Identity assault. You are bad, there is no gray area. It's that simple, black and white. Okay? Self-betrayal, I need you to agree with me that you are bad. Now, this is his research, don't get ahead of me. You are not in control. So I started looking at all of that, and I connected that to how similar that sounds to the fundamentalist message. You are inherently sinful. Sin is bad. God hates sin. You're in trouble. The sinner's prayer, there's that self-betrayal. Testify, confess publicly, tell your priest. God is in control. Remember that? We're not in control. Not a damn thing you can do about your life. Step 2, in his coercive persuasion, introducing the possibility of salvation. His words, not mine. Channeling of guilt. Your disobedience is why you are in pain. Obedience or compliance will stop the pain. Releasing of guilt. It's not me, it's my beliefs. This is brainwashing 101 from POW camps. Religious version, God punishes sinners. Obey God and you will be blessed. Disobey and you will be cursed. It's God's rules, not mine. Love the sinner, hate the sin. It's not my fault that God hates fags. Right? Third step. So they've broken everybody down. They've convinced them that they're worthless. They've convinced them that they don't have the right answer. Now they have to rebuild harmony. If you want, you can choose good. You don't have to. We already know what's going to happen. You want to suffer, keep making the choices you're making. But if you want, you can choose good, which happens to be my way. Detail. Feeling pain means you're not choosing correctly. This one really got to me. How many times do we see people in the religious communities saying that tornado, that horrible, horrible thing that killed our friends and our families, That's my fault. We as a society are making choices that are convincing God He has to punish us. I'm getting ahead of myself. This is still his research, not religious connection. Final confession and rebirth, I choose good. Still his language. Religious versions, responding to God's call is your choice to make. You can go to hell if you want to. I tried. God will punish you if you disobey His command to make the right choice. Choosing God is the only safe choice. So what happens when you grow up believing all of that? What happens when you're not an adult POW in a Chinese or Korean prison camp? You're 2 years old, and you're sitting in Sunday school, and they're teaching you this. What happens to that 2-year-old when they grow up and they're 25 years old and they're being beaten in front of their children because their husband decided they didn't make dinner correctly? When that is the mindset that you had from your earliest recollection, if I feel pain, it's because I screwed up, because God is teaching me a lesson. This is what all of these people who are coming to recovering from religion, this is what they believe. This is why they can't just flip that switch. It's not that simple. So a quick lesson in personal boundaries. There we go. Self. Pretty self-explanatory. That's your own little bubble. Everything in your own thoughts, your own dreams, in your own head, nobody can see in there unless you tell them. Then we have family, that next circle. Everybody's allowed to have these boundaries. Then we have the circle of friends, the circle of acquaintances, and finally we have strangers. These are healthy boundaries to have. It's okay to have private thoughts that no one knows anything about. It's completely okay to have a circle of people you consider your family who have different or more information, more intimate knowledge of you than people outside of that circle. That's all okay. So where does God fit into this circle? There's no boundaries. I remember when I was 8 years old, my grandmother died. It's my missionary grandmother. Went to the funeral and did the whole thing. 8-year-olds hate funerals. Point being, about a week later, was going to the bathroom. For 8-year-olds, that can be a pretty mortifying thing if anybody sees you, right? Door opens, oh my gosh, everybody freaks out. I had this incredible thought. My grandma was watching me pee. It was horrifying to me. And then I had the next thought, which was all of her family, anybody who's ever died, is watching me in the bathroom. And I prayed to God and asked Him if He could please turn that part off, because I wanted a little privacy. That's the concept. To an 8-year-old, it's embarrassing about where you're going to the bathroom. To a 30-year-old, it's embarrassing when they're thinking about sex or who they want to have sex with. To a 55-year-old, same conversation. So what kind of boundaries can you have when you aren't even allowed the privacy of your own thoughts? Is it any wonder that people coming out of religion struggle with identifying, setting, and enforcing appropriate boundaries? Where do you begin? Where do you end? When do other people have permission? So how does this indoctrination start? How do we inculcate it into everybody's mindset? Here's a really famous song. I'm sure most people are familiar with it. Amazing Grace. Everybody know that song? Mm-hmm. Yes? Okay, we're not going to sing it, I promise. It's not going to skip. It's good. What about this? How sweet the sound that saved a wretch. A wretch. That's the happiest song they have. They love that song. They sing this song all the time. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear. This is a great song. Here's another one. This is a pretty famous gospel song. So if you're not familiar with Southern gospel, this one might not be too familiar with you, but I'm going to read through it. And this is one, if you YouTube it, you'll find lots of pastors and churches all singing this together, and they cry and they're so upset. Well, they're happy tears apparently, but Unworthy am I of the grace that he gave, unworthy to hold his hand, amazed that a king would reach down to a slave. This love I cannot understand. Unworthy, a beggar in bondage and alone, but he made me worthy, and now by his grace, his mercy has made me his own. My sorrow and sickness laid stripes on his back. That's brutal. My sins caused the blood that was shed. My faults and my failures have woven a crown of thorns that he wore on his head. That is that repetitive mantra. That is what 3-year-olds are singing, what kids are singing in youth group, what young adults are singing in their college, rock the cross, whatever they do now. I'm not up on the cool Christian stuff anymore. That's what they do. And in case you're wondering if some crackpot just made up that song and it just happened to go viral in the whole Southern Baptist community, here's the verse it comes from. So you also, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, we are unworthy servants, we have only done our duty. Think of the messages in that one little verse. You've done everything you were told to do, and you're still a pile of shit. All right, quick little thing on this. So you have a whole bunch of people who, by the hundreds, thousands, millions, have been told that they're unworthy, they're worthless, they're crap, nothing they can do will ever be good enough. They need someone to tell them what Jesus says every Sunday. Because of this dynamic, we have ministers who breed off of that narcissism, that concept of, I will tell you everything you need to know, because remember, you are not good enough. God talks to me. All right. So Seth touched on this a little bit ago. When you talk to people who are religious and they're telling you, you have a problem with religion. I don't have a religion. What do they say? I have a relationship. It's not about religion. It's about a relationship. One of the things I want you to be able to do at the end of this talk is be able to explain to them why that's the problem. So what does it mean to have a relationship with God? How do you do that? This is taken directly from Steps to Salvation. It's online. You can Google it. I didn't write this. This is the ABC. I was telling you about a little bit ago. Admit that you need a relationship with God. God loves us even if we haven't loved Him. Our relationship with God was broken by our sin. Remember that coercive persuasion? They have this on their websites. They're proud of this. Believe that Jesus made your relationship with God possible through His death and resurrection. There is nothing you can do, no matter how good or great, to ever restore your relationship with God. Confess your sin, turn from it, and accept God's forgiveness. That's really nice of Him. Dedicate yourself to becoming a fully devoted follower of Christ. Now, they have it in the cool ABCD format, but if you take a look at it and think back to a few minutes ago when we were talking about the coercive persuasion, this is every single step. So when you believe this, when you go your entire life being taught that you have no right to boundaries, God is in your innermost thoughts, you have absolutely no say in your life whatsoever, nothing is in your control, you are a perpetual victim, we create hallmarks for codependency. You don't believe you are worthy of love. Codependency is a psychological concept where people have a problem with boundaries and setting limits and understanding where they end and other people begin. I won't ask anyone to self-identify, but I'm sure people here are familiar with that. People who are codependent, they don't believe they're worthy of love. They obey to avoid the anger and wrath of others. Again, this is from a psychology concept. We're off of a religious concept right now. You'll sacrifice other relationships for this one. Your goals and life plans depend on their approval. It is a one-way relationship. You do all the work. I think that kind of sums it up, doesn't it? So what we've learned. Religion teaches dysfunctional thinking from the earliest age possible. A relationship with an absent creator teaches codependent behavior. Religion is a magnet for narcissistic personalities who benefit from leading people who believe they are lost. And leaving religion to learn healthy boundaries takes much, much more than logic and reason. So what can you do? This is what I was saying earlier. This applies to all of you. You can learn to recognize the attitudes and behaviors of dysfunctional thinking. When I do smaller talks, I have handouts. If you're interested in getting a copy, let me know. I can email it over to you. Discuss, don't argue. When you're talking to people who are questioning and trying to figure out their place on that spectrum, find validity in their viewpoint and seek common ground. They have been told their whole life they're wrong no matter what. Imagine how empowering it is when some crazy satanic atheist says, you have a point. You're validating them. Use I instead of you. Own your own feelings. Encourage them to own theirs. Listen for can't. Encourage won't. Use words that identify actions and choices. One of the biggest things we get in our private support group online, people will say, I can't tell my parents I don't believe. I can't stop going to church. I can't stop teaching Sunday school. You can. You can physically make that choice. In their mind, they can't. It doesn't occur to them because remember, they were taught they were powerless. So one of the things we do is we say, well, you could. Here's what could happen. We understand why that might not be a good choice for you right now, but you could. There's a lot of things you could do. Just that tiny little bit of phrasing makes a huge difference in how they see the world. Encourage healthy boundaries. Empower them to say no. Saying no is enforcing a boundary. I used to be terrible at saying no, and anyone who worked with me with Apostacon is not allowed to comment on how I am now. Empower them to say no. Saying no is enforcing the boundary. So here's the thing. When people who are newly out of religion are coming to our secular groups, you have a really hard time saying no. They want to fit in. They don't know how they fit in. Empower them to say no. If you're having a potluck and they don't know what to bring and they have no idea and it's too many choices, it could be as simple as just saying, you could just come. It's okay if you can't bring anything. Don't worry about it. Little things like that, empowering them to set a limit and say that's too much. I'm being told I've got 5 minutes, I gotta read it. Sorry guys. Visibly respect their boundaries. Ask to give hugs, more give permission to say no. Create a safe environment for them to discover what it feels like to have their boundaries respected. Being respected is a new concept. They will not recognize it right away. They don't know what that feels like. That concept that they have an inherent right to be and feel respected for their rights to say no, to set a boundary, to have their own identity that doesn't conflict or that doesn't interact with you. They can do that. It's a dance, not a race. That tiny little thing that you can do to empower them to set their boundaries, to say no, to keep exploring. It's not going to flip a switch overnight. But that little interaction, that little bit of respect, that's the first time they've gotten it in years, maybe their entire life, that could be the start of that domino effect, where they start exploring, they start reading books, they start trying to find their own answers for the first time in their life. Be truthful, but be respectful. Dave talked about that yesterday. I won't go into that because I'm short on time. Religion tells them who they are, what to think, and what value they have in the world. Our job is to remind them they are okay, just the way they are. All right, so resources. I'm big on recommending books. I've got a few books up here. The God Virus, obviously, Dr. Darrell Ray is the founder of Recovering from Religion, but he's also the author of 2 really, really awesome books. The God Virus and Sex and God. Highly recommend them to anyone who is going through the process of recovering from religion, or if you know someone who is, because it will help you understand all of this a lot better. Deconverted, Seth's book. That is a fantastic commentary on this process. It's really good. He's approachable. That man could read me a phone book and I'd be happy, but regardless. And encouraging your friends to read it, encouraging these people to read it, with the encouragement of, this is someone who understands what you're going through. You're not trying to change their mind, this is just what happened to them. Godless by Dan Barker. The reason I recommend this one is really important. Most of you know Dan used to be a minister. And being able to read a deconversion process from the point of view of a minister is really important for people who believe that ministers will never, ever, ever walk away from God. It's great information. The last two are not technically secular books, but they're really awesome. One's called Taming Your Gremlin, How to Get Out of Your Own Way. It actually specifically addresses the concept of that internal thought process and how to begin setting boundaries and enforcing them. So if anybody here is identifying with what I'm saying, you want that book. The last one of my favorites, How to Be a Really Great Pain in the Ass. It's great. It teaches critical thinking, but not from such a scholarly aspect that you get lost. So people who are really unfamiliar with critical thinking, we know what we're talking about, they can really use that book and they'll learn a lot. How to get involved in recovering from religion. The Secular Therapist Project. If you or someone you know is a therapist, please sign up. We need more therapists. If you need someone who is a secular therapist, please go and register, and we will try to connect you with someone in your area. The Hotline Project, we are still working on that. We have an absolute incredible number of volunteers who have come, and Susie Box is helping me with that, so I have to point her out and embarrass her. Start an RR group in your area. This is really important. These groups are kind of fluid. They ebb and flow, and sometimes they kind of aren't needed for a little while and then pop back into existence. But these things are invaluable to people who are out enough to be able to go. There's more areas you can volunteer on the RR website, and you can support our efforts through your donation. Change is a process. I don't know how many of you noticed the very first slide was the Recovering from Religion logo on black. There was no specific moment that the background of my slides went from dark to light. Recovering from religion is a process for many that is long and extremely difficult. And just like you won't notice when that slide became light, you're not necessarily going to see when someone recovers from religion. The process is difficult. It affects people and their relationships all around them. They need our help. These stories, your stories, my story, the hundreds of people who flock to recovering from religion, our stories are the result of this inerrant belief. Our stories are the consequences of faith. And our community is why we need you to support recovering from religion. Thank you.